Hello, everyone, and welcome to a conversation about the role of the Department of Justice when it comes to voting rights. My name is Jasmine Costin. I am Senior Director of Community Engagement with the Urban League, and we are so happy to be here with you to talk more about voting rights. We have two amazing panelists today, Rickell Smith and Gabe Davis, who will be participating in this conversation, and I'm going to give them a chance to introduce themselves. We'll start with you, Rickell.
Hello, everyone. I am Rickell Smith, the Executive Director of Center for Social Justice at Urban League. I have the privilege of working directly with Jasmine Costin on voting rights advocacy. Prior to taking on this role, I was a practicing civil rights attorney, and I represented incarcerated persons, both adults and young people, represented young people in constitutional rights cases, also education cases. And my claim to fame is I was a part of a team that had one voting rights case here in the state of Ohio that was filed in 2012 on behalf of voters that were incarcerated or detained, rather, at the Justice Center. So I am happy to participate in this discussion and definitely happy to be here with Gabe Davis.
Thank you so much. Rickell, Gabe?
Yes, good evening. My name is Gabe Davis, and I am an alumnus of the Department of Justice. I worked for the Civil Rights Division and worked for them for about 3.5 years. And through that role, I was in the criminal section. And so I did not handle voting cases directly, but we did do civil rights work across the country. And in the course of doing working on those cases, I traveled throughout the South investigating and prosecuting civil rights crimes, which principally were hate crimes, but also official misconduct cases involving police allegations of abuse and things of that nature. I also was a candidate for office. So I had that perspective as well. I ran for county prosecutor a little while ago here in Hamilton County, and had been a poll observer in elections in the past as well. So I do have some other perspectives that I think will help round out this discussion in addition to my civil rights DOJ credentials there. And finally, I'm currently serving at the city of Cincinnati as the director of the Citizen Complaint Authority. I've been doing that for about a year. And just a quick disclaimer that all views expressed today are my own. These are not the views of the city of Cincinnati. So I'm speaking solely on behalf of Gabe Davis here today. But I'm happy to be with you and with you as well, Rickell. Thank you very much.
Thank you both. I'm excited that you bring such experience and such wealth of knowledge to this discussion. Just to give a bit of context, at the Urban League, we have really been doubling down on the work of voting rights and making sure that our community is educated about what's going on. It seems like ever since President Biden spoke about his priorities around voting rights, we've kind of done the work of educating our constituents around, what are voting rights? What are some key terms? What is the timeline, for voting access in this country and things of that nature? And the goal of this conversation really is to kind of expand to see what are some other ways that we can fight for the vote. President Biden specifically, mentioned the role of the Department of Justice. And so, we're going to talk a little bit about that today. But what is the Department of Justice? Let's kind of get that and go on a really basic level so that people can understand that. So I'll start with you, Gabe. What is the role? What is the United States Department of Justice? Excuse me.
Yeah, so the Department of Justice is essentially the principal litigating arm, or it's the office that houses the Attorney General, and it represents the United States government in litigation and in cases involving things like civil rights and other types of cases as well. So if you talk about, for instance, your housing cases, there are a subset of cases that if the government has an interest in those, then the Department of Justice will defend the government in those cases. If we're talking about voting, there are a series of voting laws that the federal government has an interest in enforcing, and the Department of Justice will enforce those and argue those on behalf of the United States. And then you talk about the criminal laws as well, federal prosecutors or things of that nature, then the federal government, again, has that interest. And so the Department of Justice represents the government in cases. And in essence, really is the Attorney General is the people's lawyer, so to speak, and the Department of Justice is the infrastructure for all that litigation, all that lawyering that takes place on behalf of the United States and on behalf of the people of the United States.
Oh, that's really helpful. So the Attorney General is over the Department of Justice. So it's kind of, that's he is the people's, or they serve as the people's attorney, and then the Department of Justice is kind of the people who work for them. Is that correct?
Yes, and I think just to be clear, I mean, the Attorney General does answer to the president, so there are a set of marching orders there and a reporting structure in place. But I think, oftentimes they like to think of themselves as being the people's voice as well. And we, Attorneys General don't just serve the president; you serve the Constitution. You swear an oath and things of that nature. But you are bringing those cases, and you are standing up and you're arguing on behalf of interests that really serve the entire population here in the United States.
And thank you. Can you tell us more, Rickell, about the Civil Rights Division?
Sure. And I can talk more from an outside trial litigator and the impact that DOJ or the Civil Rights Division has had on my cases. So the DOJ is organized by like regional offices. So there is a lot of work, or the on the ground work happens out of those regional offices. And from a policy advocacy and trial attorney's perspective, I've seen the DOJ step in 2 ways that was helpful in moving things forward, I will say. One is filing a statement of interest in a case. So if I filed a lawsuit on behalf of either an individual or a group of people, the Department of Justice, the Civil Rights Unit, can file a statement of interest, which means that they have a concern or the outcome of the case is impactful. There's some legal requirements for them to do so, but typically when DOJ files a statement of interest, the other side wants to settle.
Okay, that's important.
Right, that is not a good sign, because in that statement of interest, they do give a clue into what their position is and why it's important. So you can typically tell from that document which side they would necessarily support or what their concern is. And it has been very helpful in getting the other side, because I was representing plaintiffs in that case, the defendant in that case, or the respondent, to actually want to settle the case, because it's really serious when DOJ steps in. Okay. The other way that DOJ has been extremely helpful when it comes to advocacy work is when they issue guidance. When the Civil Rights Division issues guidance, which will be essentially like a white paper or a policy paper, it is their position on a certain aspect of the law that may be controversial. So they just come out, instead of, entering into a specific case, they'll say, we have all these cases across the country, and we're going to let you know where we stand on this. Okay. And it's been helpful for me as a trial attorney, because I can always cite that and say, okay, it's not only me who thinks that this is wrong, but the federal government, the Civil Rights Division of DOJ, has said this as well. So it provides some leverage. I said there were 2 ways, but there's really 3 ways that I think that they have been helpful too, is that the Civil Rights Division has a lot of autonomy and leeway to investigate. Okay. And sometimes by virtue of just investigating an issue, and it's investigation in the simplest definition, where they are literally seeking information, but they talk to people in your jurisdiction. And when they talk to people, people are like, okay, the stuff that we're doing is probably bringing us too much attention from the federal government. And sometimes that can also influence, I would say, bad actors, from my view, to do the right thing or do what we want them to do to preserve our rights.
Okay. Thank you for that. That really enlightened me, because I don't think that I was really clear that they could intervene in all of those different ways. Gabe, do you have anything that you'd like to expand upon?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just add, I think that's all right. And it's so, just to underscore that point, when the DOJ decides to investigate something, it really can bring a lot of attention and shine a spotlight in ways that really does want to cause folks to settle and to enter into agreements to really avoid litigation to begin with, because nobody wants to potentially be sued by the Department of Justice for civil rights abuses or for violations of the Constitution, depending on what's being investigated. And that we've seen it across the country with DOJ and police departments, for example. And I think we're seeing it now in the voting context with different states, where the Department of Justice is investigating the laws and the practices that different states have enacted, in the wake of the 2020 election. And so, oftentimes it can be a powerful tool just in its mere presence in investigating a case and announcing that, hey, this is of concern to the federal government. And if we're investigating it, that means that we might file a lawsuit here. And that's going to bring some unwanted attention and might result in the judge ordering a jurisdiction to do something that it doesn't want to do. And oftentimes, if the judge is going to order something at the end of a lawsuit, which is called an injunction, that's going to be expensive for that entity to have to contend with as well. So oftentimes, folks want to get ahead of that by settling as soon as DOJ gets involved, and it's that's a very powerful tool that the government has.
Well, thank you, because that provides the perfect segue into our next question. In his speech in July, President Biden specifically called out the Department of Justice and their role in the fight for voting rights. So what does, from your perspective, what does that process look like?
Yeah, so I'll just speak to that a little bit. And what I say is that when it comes to what DOJ can do, and I think where President Biden was calling for some increased attention was really in the area of resources. And, at the end of the day, all of these things, investigations, statements of interest, these things, it takes manpower to do these things. Mm-hmm. And you can investigate a lot more jurisdictions, for instance, if you're talking about voting, if you have more attorneys to do that work, and more in-house investigators as well, because these are civil matters. And so, at times you're using, in-house investigators, you're not necessarily using the FBI as you would in a criminal case. So, all these folks, it takes money to hire these folks and to be able to scale up and be able to impact lots of different areas and be able to potentially bring different lawsuits or file different statements of interest. And so I think what the president was really previewing here was really an emphasis on hiring more attorneys, injecting more resources, and really empowering the Department of Justice and the Civil Rights Division to go out and do more of this work. And, there are some unique challenges with the voting rights cases that we can get into, but at the end of the day, you really do want to have that critical mass of attorneys to be able to carry that work forward, and that requires resources and attention.
Thank you. Rickell, do you feel that this is an effective strategy to use by the president?
Absolutely. So if we think about any major policy shift in our country's history, whether we agree with it or not, it was typically a multifaceted strategy. Like, you had the ground game, you had community organizers or just everyday experts that believed that things should change. You also had a legal strategy, and you also had a policy change strategy. So I think that what DOJ is doing at this point, or what President Biden really announces DOJ's intention to lean in when it came to bringing the litigation muscle to this voting rights advocacy, which is, frankly speaking, very important. We talked about, the impact that DOJ being a part of a case could manifest, but more than anything, it's bringing awareness right now, right? Because if the federal government is willing to put their resources, their expertise into preserving or expanding our voting rights, then hopefully that signals a shift in the public will that we've seen over the last few years. The other thing, I pointed out that DOJ issues guidance as well. And I will say that President Biden's sort of announcement was not empty. I looked it up today, and they have put out several pieces of guidance around voting rights and post-election audits, in addition to filing the lawsuits. And again, those are all resources that local litigators or voting rights attorneys can use while they're challenging, right, these bills that may or may not pass in their jurisdiction. They can still use that DOJ muscle, if you will, without having DOJ present.
That's awesome. I think it does sound like a really effective strategy. And we know that access to the ballot is something that we need all hands on deck for, honestly. So, Gabe, you mentioned that there might be some challenges to this strategy, even though it may be a good one. What are some of those challenges that are kind of unique to using the muscle of the DOJ in this fight?
Yeah, I think one of the principal challenges is that the Supreme Court has made it really hard to bring these cases and to win on voting discrimination cases. There was a famous case years ago, I think it was Shelby County versus Holder, where the Supreme Court essentially gutted major portions of the Voting Rights Act. And just to kind of set the table a little bit, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 did a variety of things, but one of the things that it did was it allowed the Department of Justice to bring lawsuits if there were instances of either purposeful discrimination or where discrimination had occurred and was creating discriminatory effects and impacts, even if there was no discriminatory purpose. But the law also said that if states wanted to enact voting changes in their voting laws, that those states, if those states had a history of discrimination and if they were sort of classified as being as having that history by a certain formula, that those states had to get clearance from the Department of Justice or from a court in D.C. before they could enact those voting changes. It was called the pre-clearance requirement of the Voting Rights Act. And what the Supreme Court did, I think this was back in 2013, is essentially to gut portions of that law so that right now, some of those former states, many of which are in the South, but they're not exclusively there, but some of those former states that had a history of discrimination used to have to clear all their voting changes with DOJ. They don't have to do that anymore because the Supreme Court said that that's no longer required. The Supreme Court said that, those, essentially, sort of paraphrasing, but that those were things, there are problems in our past, but that right now, that progress had been made enough that they didn't think that pre-clearance was appropriate. There's a lot more to the opinion, but in essence, they said that no longer can the Department of Justice weigh in at this level before the voting restrictions go into effect. Therefore, right now, the Department of Justice has to bring lawsuits in order to stop some of these things, or private plaintiffs have to bring them. It used to be that as a default, they were just stopped until they were cleared. Now there has to be a lawsuit, which has to be won. And the Supreme Court has made it hard to win those lawsuits as well because of the way that they've interpreted the Voting Rights Act. So there are some tools there to go after, for instance, limits that are placed on voting by jurisdictions, but those are hard cases to litigate and hard cases to win.
Sure. Wow. I mean, all I can say is that the fight continues. We've been fighting for access to the ballot, especially as Black people, for such a long time. And it just seems like there's more tactics and more strategies that have been put into play to keep access away, but also that we're coming up with in order to maintain that access. So when we think about, the role of the Department of Justice, you mentioned the Supreme Court, what should an everyday citizen do? What should they know about this strategy, and how can they really support what's going on? Because it can seem, so hopeless sometimes when you're like, if this is being fought on the Supreme Court level, maybe I as regular citizen don't even know anything about that, but what can I do? What are the ways that I can support this fight to maintain access to the ballot for everyone?
So I'll lift up a couple of things, and again, to provide context, in response to what Gabe lifted up around that Supreme Court case, there's federal legislation right now pending, the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, that its primary purpose is to plug that hole and to rectify the decision that the Supreme Court has made, and again, make it necessary for those states who have had a history of voter suppression tactics to have to go through DOJ or the federal government to get approval for their changes. So that's one thing. And I mentioned that because in order to support this policy change, there are lawyers across the country that are investigating and doing some research on voter experience, right? It's sort of like they are gathering evidence to support the fact that we actually need this. So the number one thing that we can do as everyday citizens is to register to vote and vote, because you going through that process at the very least provides evidence to the folks that are looking to change policies of what needs to be changed. That's not the only reason why voting is important. We know that we have to vote for elected officials that are going to really institute the changes that we want to see in our community. So that's the number one reason to vote. But when it comes to this voting rights fight, it is very important for everyone in every election to exercise their right to vote. I will also say that if you have issues voting, if you have issues registering or issues voting, you should report that to your local board of elections, one. And two, there's also a national election protection hotline. If you report to those two, they are required to log your complaint. And again, we want to make sure that if folks are having problems voting, that it is actually reported. And then lastly, I will say, I mentioned this before, this is a multifaceted fight, right? So DOJ is stepping in and leaning in when it comes to court. There are trial attorneys all across the country that are doing the same thing. Our job is to make sure that we talk to our local legislators, especially here in Ohio, who not only have they introduced House Bill 294, which looks to restrict our voting rights or our access to vote, but also just last week, there was another bill that was introduced that would change voter ID laws. So it will require you to step in with a state issued ID, which we know will disproportionately impact people who are low income, young people who don't have their ID yet, but are eligible to vote, and then also Black and brown folks, just because of the systemic barriers that we face. Anyway, so, Urban League is doing some policy advocacy, really in opposition to these bills. I would encourage people to follow us because we do have a call to action, easy ways that you can write your local state representative so that they step in and represent your interests by saying no on these voter suppression bills.
Absolutely. Thank you, Rickell. Gabe, thoughts from you?
Yeah, it's hard to add much more to that. But what I would just say is I think it's very important to just continue to tell your story. If you have experienced something that you think has suppressed your right to vote, tell the Urban League, tell others, write op-eds about these things. We need to create a paper trail that makes it clear when these laws have had impacts that have been harmful, that have been discriminatory, that have suppressed the vote, because that helps to establish some of the claims that are brought by attorneys at the end of the day if there's a body of evidence out there. So I think that's pretty important. And like Rickell said, just contact your state reps, contact your senator, contact your House representatives, folks from the federal government as well. Let them know that you want these laws passed and how critical they are and how important they are. Personalize that experience. And people don't often realize, but the representatives do pay attention to that outreach from constituents. I know when I was an intern on Capitol Hill years and years ago, we have to respond to each and every letter. We have to respond to each and every phone call, and they want to know who was talking about what and what people were concerned about. So it really does matter if you call and if you express that you want these laws passed to protect the right to vote and to expand it, not to limit it. And I think it makes that issue important for them and not just one of many issues if it's something that you're lifting up as a citizen who's in their district. So that's very important. And then I just say, just pay attention to what's happening with the courts. It can often be very, very dry, but we have to keep our eye on the ball there as well, and ensure that we're getting the judiciary ultimately that's going to look at these things from the standpoint of the lived experience of individuals who are impacted by these laws as well. So I think that's very important. That sort of citizen activism and paying attention and being involved at all levels.
Well, thank you. So on a federal level, the John Lewis Voting Act and the For the People Act, ensuring that our representatives are voting for that and getting that passed. On a local level, we want to keep our eyes on House Bill 294 and House Bill 387 because we do not want that type of legislation. And then register to vote, right? We have the links here to check your voter registration status as well as register to vote. So, we are in this fight together and the fight continues. I want to thank you so much, Gabe and Rickell, for just this time and helping enlighten us. And, please, everyone, register to vote. if there are issues that you feel you want to know more about when it comes to voting, call us at the Urban League, at the Center for Social Justice. We are in this fight together. So thank you so much. And you'll see us again soon. Have a good night, everyone.